Imagine your grandson has been kidnapped, not for vengeance, not for politics, but because he carries your last name. He's been beaten, starved, and is now locked in a freezing cave in southern Italy. His kidnappers send you his ear literally severed from his head along with a threat to send the other. And you, one of the richest men in the history of the world, refuse to pay, not because you can't, but because, as you put it, I have 14 other grandchildren. Now ask yourself, is this the language of a rational billionaire? Or of a man who long forgot the value of human life in the pursuit of protecting wealth? Welcome back to Tragedy Uncovered, where we don't just tell stories or dissect the truths that others dare not confront. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because this is where we unravel the shocking tragedies that powerful families spend generations trying to bury. Let's begin. John Paul Getty III wasn't just anyone. He was a Getty, and that name, leased in the mid-20th century, meant one thing: oil. Oceans of it. The kind that made empires and bought governments. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., was the founder of Getty Oil and once labeled the richest man in the world by Fortune magazine. And yet, that name would nearly kill his grandson. Born in 1956, John Paul Getty III grew up in the shadows of opulence, but not necessarily in its embrace. His father, John Paul Getty Jr., was estranged from his tycoon father and had little access to the family fortune. His mother, Abigail Harris, was long divorced and living with her children in Rome, far from the marble estates and corporate corridors that bore the Getty legacy. Young Paulus's family called him drifted into the city's underground scene, falling in with artists, anarchists, and older women. He was eccentric, disobedient, and completely uninterested in the academic path that his name could have easily paved for him. Instead, he romanced danger, sometimes literally. His girlfriend at the time, a German woman named Jutta, was older, and reportedly part of conversations with Paul about staging a fake kidnapping. The idea? Trick the family into paying a ransom and split the money. It was a wild, juvenile fantasy, one that he would later regret whispering aloud. Because sometime in July of 1973, the fantasy turned fatally real. While walking through Piazza Farnese in Rome in the early hours of the morning, Paul was grabbed off the street by unknown men. He was blindfolded, thrown into a van, and driven over 500 miles south to Calabria, desolate, mountainous region notorious for being the stronghold of the 'Ndrangheta, one of Italy's most violent and secretive mafia families. There, in the depths of a remote cave, he disappeared. At first, the Getty family wasn't even sure it was real. The phone rang. A demand was made, $17 million, or the boy dies. But to the family patriarch, this was unconfirmed. It sounded too familiar. After all, Paul had joked about a fake kidnapping before. And so, the richest man alive did nothing. Instead of panic, there was skepticism. Instead of helicopters and negotiators, there were whispers and family meetings. The belief that Paul was either pulling a con or exaggerating the danger cost the family something greater than money: time. Inside the cave, the boy's situation rapidly deteriorated. His captors, professional criminals, grew angry. They took away his radio. They killed a bird he had caught and grown attached to. Then, things escalated. Paul was subjected to beatings, psychological torture, and eventually, something more grotesque. They began playing Russian roulette with a gun against his head. When they realized no one was coming, they sent a letter, Paul's handwritten note, in shaky Italian. Read, "Dear Mommy, since Monday I have fallen into the hands of kidnappers. Don't let me be killed." But it still wasn't enough. So the mafia decided to escalate the horror into a visual campaign. For months into the abduction, An envelope arrived at the offices of an Italian newspaper. Inside was a lock of hair, a typed note, and a severed human ear. It was Paul's. The note read, coldly, "This is Paul's ear. If we do not receive money in 10 days, the other ear will arrive." In essence, the message was simple: we will send him back in pieces. This moment should have shaken the Getty dynasty into action. And in some ways, it did. But not because of urgency. Not because of love. Not because they feared for Paul's life. Instead, the only movement came after the mafia dropped their demand from $17 million to just over $3 million. Why the change? Well, some say the 'Ndrangheta grew desperate. But others suggest a chilling alternative. The Getty patriarch himself had begun negotiating. Not for his grandson's safety, but for a better price. And here's where the story crosses into something more grotesque than greed. Paul Getty Sr. finally agreed to pay $2 million, not because he felt responsible, but because that was the maximum amount he could legally deduct from his taxes. The remaining sum? He loaned it to Paul Getty Jr. Paul's fat hair at 4% interest. Yes, you heard that right. A grandfather negotiated his grandson's ransom like a business expense, then loaned the rest to his own son. With interest. This isn't fiction. This happened. And it says more about the cost of wealth than any bank ledger ever could. If this shocked you or made you ask hard questions, stay with us. Make sure you subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you don't miss the rest of this story and the ones we reveal next. Because the truth doesn't always make headlines, but we believe it still deserves to be heard. When John Paul Getty III was finally released, it wasn't a dramatic reunion. There were no warm embraces or tearful hugs captured by flashing cameras. No moment of family redemption. Instead, authorities found him dazed, weak, and physically devastated, standing alone at a gas station in southern Italy. He had been held captive for over 5 months. He was now 17, older by a year, but aged by decades in trauma. By then, he had pneumonia. He was malnourished. His ear was missing. The wound had gone untreated for so long that infection nearly took his life. The captors, at one point, tried treating him with antibiotics. But when that failed and Paul developed an allergy, they resorted to giving him large quantities of alcohol to numb his pain. And so, the boy who once joked about faking a kidnapping came back, not just physically mutilated, but addicted and psychologically fragmented. But perhaps the most painful part of his return wasn't what the kidnappers had done, it was what his own family hadn't. When he got home, Paul's mother told him something that must have felt like a second blow. He needed to call his grandfather and say thank you. Thank you for finally paying the ransom. Thank you for saving his life. So he called. Or rather, he tried. The line rang. The operator at the estate took the message. And then came the answer. J. Paul Getty Sr. refused to take the call. It's hard to imagine a colder silence than that. This wasn't just financial neglect anymore. It was something deeper, an emotional vacuum. Paul, barely surviving a horror that would traumatize any adult, was left to wonder if his life had ever truly mattered to the man who bore his name. That realization, many believe, would haunt him far more than the captivity itself. Now, one might argue, was the grandfather just being cautious? Was he trying to prevent a future wave of ransoms targeting the rest of the family? Let's be fair, perhaps. But here's the thing, Getty Sr. didn't stop at caution. He went further. The public later learned that he installed a payphone in his mansion, so that guests could place their own calls, and he wouldn't have to foot the bill. The man was, by every account, obsessed with the preservation of wealth even in the smallest ways. And when it came to his own family, there was no exception. What kind of legacy does that leave behind? In the months after his release, Paul tried to return to a semblance of normal life. He reunited with his girlfriend. Yuta, who had been pregnant during the ordeal. They married soon after, and in 1974, they welcomed their son, Balthazar Getty, a name some might recognize today as an actor and musician. It seemed like the beginning of something redemptive, a fresh start. A young family trying to rebuild on the ashes of tragedy. But the foundation was too broken. Behind the surface of stability was a man unraveling. Paul struggled with alcoholism, deep anxiety, and an inability to adjust to the rhythms of a world that had moved on while he was left behind. He bounced between countries, fell in with artists, filmmakers, and experimental communities. At one point, he even appeared in two avant-garde films, one involving cannibalism, the other laced with mafia themes. Whether that was a form of self-expression or self-sabotage, no one can say for sure. What we do know is this: his life after the kidnapping was marked by a slow, painful descent, and no one from the family empire truly stepped in to stop the fall. By the early 1980s, Paul was in New York, alone. Yuta had taken their child and moved to San Francisco. She had grown weary, understandably, off Paul's spiral into addiction and instability. He, meanwhile, leaned harder into substance abuse. Not for fun, not for rebellion, but as a way to silence what couldn't be forgotten. And then came the collapse. In 1981, Paul suffered a catastrophic health event. A mix of substances caused a stroke and liver failure, a lethal combination that left him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lost the ability to speak. He became partially blind. And at just 25 years old, he was a quadriplegic. Let that sink in. This was a young man who had survived one of the most high-profile kidnappings in modern history. He had endured torture, mutilation, and public humiliation. And now, after years of trying to escape it all, he found himself trapped once again, this time inside his own broken body. You might think, at this point, that the Getty family would rally around him, that they would bring him home, surround him with care, help him reclaim even a fragment of dignity. But that's not what happened. Paul's mother, once again, became his primary caregiver. The same woman who had no access to the family fortune, no private jets or legal teams, no deep pockets to fund round-the-clock medical support. She did what she could, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, she was forced to sue her ex-husband, John Paul Getty Jr., Paul's father, for help. She asked for $28,000 a month in support to cover medical bills. Not millions, not indulgences, just basic, life-sustaining care. His father resisted. And here's where the irony twists like a knife. By this time, John Paul Getty Jr. had become a knight, honored for his philanthropy and donations across Europe. He had given millions to art galleries, museums, and foundations. He was generous to the public, but not, it seemed, to his own son. The only person within the family who stepped forward briefly was Gordon Getty, Paul's uncle. He paid some of the initial bills, but even that assistance eventually faded into silence. Paul was left, once again, on the margins of the empire that bore his name. By the time John Paul Getty III entered his 30s, he had become something of a living contradiction, both a symbol of survival and a prisoner of it. His body was broken, his voice was silenced, but his name remained loud-etched into headlines, film scripts, and legal documents. The Getty name, once synonymous with dominance in the oil industry, was now tangled in lawsuits, tabloids, and whispered regret. And at the center of it all was a young man wheelchair-bound, half-blind, and voiceless. Woe's greatest misfortune may not have been being kidnapped by the mafia, but being born into one of the wealthiest families in history without access to its humanity. Let's be clear, Getty III wasn't a perfect person. He struggled. He spiraled. He made mistakes. But what stands out most isn't his imperfection. It's how entire generations of his family, each worth hundreds of millions, stood by and watched him fall, again and again, without extending more than a reluctant hand. There's something profoundly unsettling about that. After his stroke, the legal battle to secure his care went public. His mother, Abigail, who had long been excluded from the Getty fortune, filed suit against John Paul Jr., demanding financial support for their son's round-the-clock medical needs. And the figure she asked, $4.28,000 a month, was hardly extravagant in the world of elite healthcare, especially considering that Getty Jr. had access to a trust fund paying him over $20 million annually. But he resisted, delayed, minimized. It wasn't until court intervention that Paul finally received the level of care he desperately needed. Not because of fatherly love, not because of duty, but because the law compelled it. It's worth asking what would have happened if Paul's mother hadn't fought so fiercely. Would the heir to one of the greatest fortunes of the 20th century have been left in a second-rate facility, abandoned by the very empire he symbolized? As the years wore on, Paul's world grew smaller. He spent most of his time under 24-hour care, often in the English countryside, far removed from the cities and spotlight he once knew. His wife, Jutta, had long since relocated to Germany. Their marriage, while never marred by public scandal, had quietly unraveled under the weight of addiction, trauma, and emotional distance. Their son, Balthazar, was raised largely outside the Getty orbit, and perhaps that was a gift in disguise. There were brief moments of reconnection with the family. Later in life, John Paul Jr., having acquired the title of Sir for his philanthropic efforts, purchased a large estate in Buckinghamshire and invited Paul to stay. For a time, they shared that space. Whether reconciliation occurred in the quiet rooms of that estate, no one knows for certain. But let's not romanticize it. By then, the damage was deep and permanent. Paul required assistance with every daily function. He could not speak, could barely see, and lived under medical supervision around the clock. The man who had once dreamed of escaping his family's shadow had become entirely dependent on their reluctant mercy. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., had long since passed, leaving behind a financial legacy that remained intact, but a personal one that felt hollow. The elder Getty died in 1976, just 3 years after Paul's kidnapping. At the time, he was still considered one of the wealthiest men on earth. But when reporters covered his funeral, they noted something odd. Few family members attended. The empire, it seemed, had grown too rich for its own roots. There's a lesson buried here, but it's not the one people often expect. This isn't simply a story about what money can't buy. That message is overused and underfelt. Instead, this is about what money often replaces: responsibility, connection, empathy, accountability. John Paul Getty III was never just a victim of a violent crime. He was a casualty of systemic indifference. A boy whose trauma was passed around boardrooms and legal documents like a bad investment. A name that conjured headlines, but rarely compassion. His slow decline, marked by physical deterioration and emotional abandonment, serves as a grim metaphor for what happens when empires prioritize legacy over life. There were no movie-like moments of forgiveness, no final embrace that tied it all up neatly. There was just time, a long stretch of quiet, painful time. And for all the journalists who covered his kidnapping, all the books and films that followed, few stuck around to cover the final years. The Getty story had been told. The ransom had been paid. The year had been mailed. The family drama had played out. But the man, now a ghost in a shell, was left behind. In 2011, Paul Getty III died at the age of 54. The official cause: complications from his long-term health condition, stemming from that overdose 3 decades earlier. He passed away at his father's estate, perhaps the most ironic detail of all. Not in a hospital, not alone in a care home, but back within the walls of a family legacy that had both built and destroyed him. His death marked the quiet end to a story that had once screamed across global headlines. And with it came a reckoning, one not of wealth lost, but of morality unclaimed. Because in the end, what haunted most people wasn't just the kidnapping. It was the realization that, at every critical turn in this young man's life, the people with the most resources had the least willingness to act. And if that's not a tragedy worth uncovering, what is? Even after John Paul Getty III passed away, his story refused to fade. It continued to circulate not just in obituaries or legacy pieces, but in books, documentaries, films, and cultural commentary. There was something about the Getty kidnapping that embedded itself deep into the public imagination. It wasn't just a news event. It became a symbol of power, wealth, cruelty, and the deep fractures that run beneath the surface of the world's most privileged families. But why? Why do stories like this linger? Why are we so drawn to tales of broken heirs, cold-hearted patriarchs, and unimaginable wealth failing to protect its own? The answer is uncomfortable, because they remind us that even among those who seem to have everything, there can exist a total absence of something essential. And when a family like the Gettys falters not financially, but morally, it offers society a strange kind of reassurance that money might not protect you from the human condition. The media, of course, played a massive role in shaping how this story lived on. After Paul's release in 1973, photos of his frail body, mutilated ear, and dazed expressions circulated across the globe. But these weren't just images of a rescued victim, they were icons of a fallen prince. A modern-day cautionary tale. The Getty kidnapping wasn't just crime reporting. It was narrative gold, a story with villains, victims, and moral ambiguity. And as the years went on, the story transformed. It was no longer just about what happened. It was about what it meant. Authors began to peel back the layers, publishing biographies like Painfully Rich and Man on Fire. These books didn't just chronicle the events, they scrutinized the family, the psychological damage, the legacy of silence. The titles themselves told the truth. This wasn't just a family that had too much money. It was a family that seemed to pay for it in pain. Eventually, Hollywood came calling. In 2017, director Ridley Scott released All the Money in the World, a dramatized version of the Getty kidnapping, with Christopher Plummer famously stepping in at the last minute to portray J. Paul Getty Sr. The film reignited public interest and framed the story for a new generation. Viewers were reminded not just of the crime but of the chilling indifference with which the elder Getty navigated it. It was a sharp portrait. A man so fixated on wealth preservation that he measured his grandson's life in tax deductions. But this cinematic lens did more than just retell the story. It raised questions the world still grapples with. What does wealth owe to its bloodline? Is generational power inherently corrupting? Can institutions built on conquest ever truly foster empathy? In portraying Getty Sr. as a calculating, frigid titan, the film tapped into something timeless: the suspicion that the wealthiest among us often feel the least. That the higher you rise in financial empire, the more detached you become from the lives tethered to you. To some viewers, this was a grotesque caricature. To others, it was uncomfortably accurate. Yet despite the grim nature of the story, the public's fascination remained oddly persistent. Comment threads filled with outrage, but also with voyeurism. People dissected Getty's psychology, his relationships, his drug use, his failure to recover. They judged him, pitted him, speculated about his motives. And in doing so, they often overlooked the deeper truth. That the trauma he experienced wasn't just physical or financial, it was familial. Paul wasn't simply hurt by criminals. He was devastated by the people who were supposed to protect him. This is where the narrative begins to cross into something beyond scandal or biography. It becomes a reflection of how our society responds to pain when it's wrapped in silk and gold. There's a tendency to dismiss wealthy victims as somehow less worthy of empathy, as if their money should have insulated them from harm, and their suffering is proof of their own failure. But trauma doesn't scale with bank accounts. And abandonment, neglect, and psychological collapse do not discriminate between mansions and trailers. If anything, the isolation of wealth can make those experiences worse, lonelier, less believed. Paul Getty III's story reminds us that when the cameras go away and the headlines lose interest, the echo of neglect remains, not just in the mind of the victim, but in the culture that turned it into entertainment. And yet, there's another layer still. Over time, Paul's kidnapping began to symbolize not just a personal tragedy but the rotting foundation of inherited empires. Families like the Gettys, the Rockefellers, the Estorsol built fortunes on extraction, whether of oil, land, or labor. And what these stories often reveal is that no amount of money can guarantee healthy relationships, intergenerational trust, or moral clarity. We watch these dynasties crumble from within, not because they run out of money, but because they run out of love. The Getty saga became shorthand for this phenomenon. A family so steeped in wealth that it forgot how to feel. A boy whose suffering was met not with rescue, but with negotiation. A name that echoed in every courtroom and newspaper, while the person behind it withered. And in the background of all this, the public watched, sometimes in outrage, sometimes in morbid curiosity, and occasionally in silence. Perhaps that's the most uncomfortable part. The way we turn tragedies like these into parables, then move on, as if the pain has been paid for, as if the lesson has been learned. But has it? What makes the Getty kidnapping still resonate today isn't just its gruesome details, or the sheer wealth surrounding it, or even the Hollywood adaptations. It's the way it echoes. Because as much as we'd like to believe this story belongs to a different era, to a time when billionaires were cloaked in mystery and tabloid drama was confined to printed pages, it's clear we're still watching this cycle play out. The names may change. The headlines may be digital now. But the themes? They haven't evolved all that much. Every few years, a new scandal emerges involving a high-profile family, a tech mogul disinheriting their children, a political dynasty engulfed in lawsuits, a celebrity heir spiraling into addiction. Or worse, the public follows along, first with fascination, then with judgment, and eventually with forgetfulness. What Paul Getty's life illustrates is something we're still reluctant to face. That wealth does not eliminate human vulnerability, it often conceals it. Trauma doesn't vanish behind gates and guards. It just becomes quieter, more expensive to treat, harder to notice until it erupts. And when it does, society has a way of blaming the victim while still demanding the spectacle. Look at how we consume these stories. We click, we share, we debate motives, assign guilt, pick apart family trees, all from the distance of a screen. We reduce complex emotional realities into digestible narratives. But behind each one, there's often a person slowly unraveling under the pressure of public curiosity and private pain. Getty III's story was never just about a boy being kidnapped. It was about what happened when the people who were supposed to save him didn't. That's a scenario many can relate to, not in the literal sense, but emotionally. Feeling abandoned, unseen, devalued. The only difference here is the scale. The zeros in the bank account, the marble estates and bodyguards. But the emotional core, the sense of being disposable, is something many people, even outside the world of privilege, understand all too well. So maybe the reason this story lingers isn't because we envy the Getty fortune. It's because we fear what it couldn't prevent. In many ways, the Getty kidnapping was a public morality play. It revealed uncomfortable truths about power and family, about how decisions are made when love and money collide. It held up a mirror to the institutions we admire: wealth, legacy, control, and quietly asked, is this what we want? Because here's the irony. Despite all the tools at their disposal, lawyers, accountants, publicists, private security, the Getty family still fractured like any other. The difference was, their cracks were lit by flashbulbs. And yet, even with that exposure, there was little public reckoning inside the empire itself. No major philanthropic pivot. No foundation created in Paul's name to help trauma victims. No sustained effort to turn tragedy into meaningful social change. There was simply the next generation. Children who grew up in the shadow of scandal. A name they couldn't erase. A cautionary tale attached to their identity, whether they wanted it or not. This, too, is part of the inheritance. Not just trust funds or properties or oil royalties, but the burden of unresolved pain. The whispers in elite circles. The pressure to avoid becoming the next Paul. We tend to think of inheritance in legal terms. But trauma is generational. 2. Emotional neglect. Silence. Performance over connection. These things don't end with a funeral. They imprint. Now, to be fair, not every wealthy family operates like the Gettys did. Some do respond to tragedy with compassion, course correction, and accountability. But the Getty case remains infamous precisely because of how public, how prolonged, and how calculating the response appeared to be. When a grandfather compares paying his grandson's ransom to opening the door to 14 more kidnappings, we see something chilling. Not just frugality, not just caution, but an instinct to preserve assets at all costs, even the cost of a child's life. That calculus has consequences, not just for one generation, but for those that follow. Because what message does it send when love is subject to negotiation? When survival becomes a line item on a ledger? It's a question that still hovers over every boardroom and family trust today. In recent years, cultural conversations have shifted. There's more awareness now about emotional abuse, about the importance of mental health, about how trauma festers when denied. We've seen the rise of memoirs, interviews, and documentaries from children of the elite, stories of cold parents, performative affection, and generational damage cloaked in designer clothing. And yet, the patterns remain. Money remains a powerful silencer, a decorator of dysfunction, a way to postpone, obscure, or buy your way out of confrontation. But it can't erase a history. It can't undo what a child remembers when no one came to help. The Getty kidnapping was the headline, but the real story was always about what happened afterward. The way a boy's life was quietly dismantled behind the scenes. The way his name became both armor and curse. The way, even after escaping from one prison, he remained trapped in another, his own body, his own legacy. What makes the story of John Paul Getty III linger so heavily isn't just its cruelty or wealth. It's that it dares to leave us without resolution, without the comfort of heroes or closure, without a clear moral you can fit on a postcard. There was no redemption arc, no public apology from the family, no grand act of restoration to balance out the failure. Paul's life didn't end in triumph, nor did it vanish quietly. It ended suspended in a gray space that we, as a society, often don't know how to process. A space where wealth coexists with neglect, where privilege fails to protect, where survival is not necessarily healing. And maybe that's why this story resists fading away. Because it touches something we'd rather avoid. The uncomfortable reality that suffering doesn't discriminate, but our compassion often does. We tend to reserve sympathy for the visibly powerless, the poor, the victimized, the voiceless. But when someone is born into extraordinary privilege, we assume that suffering doesn't stick, that money acts as a kind of emotional shield, that anyone raised in castles must be immune to loneliness. Paul Getty III proved otherwise. His story wasn't tragic because he lost his ear. It wasn't tragic because he drank too much or fell into despair. It was tragic because when he reached out bleeding, broken, terrified, the people with the most power to help hesitated, negotiated, questioned whether he was worth it. And if you look past the details, the Italian mafia, the tax-deductible ransom, the estate in Buckinghamshire, you'll find a very human story. A story about what happens when those we trust with our safety value reputation more than responsibility. Optics over action, distance over intimacy. When Paul's grandfather died, he left behind an oil empire, museums, foundations, a net worth that remained unmatched in his time. His legacy lived on in buildings, corporations, and endowments. But when people today speak of the Getty name, it's not the oil that comes up first, it's the ear. That single image, Paul's severed ear sent in an envelope to force his family's hand, has outlasted the oil fields. It became a permanent symbol of wealth without mercy, of love turned into leverage. And that says something about the kind of legacy that truly lasts. Because we don't remember Getty Sr. as a financial genius. We remember him as the man who wouldn't answer the phone when his grandson called to say thank you for saving his life. Let that sink in. For all the zeros in his accounts, all the art on his walls, that moment of silence became louder than all his achievements. There's a particular cruelty in how Paul's pain was consumed by the public. The photos, the headlines, the mythologizing. Over time, he became less of a person and more of a concept, the boy who was kidnapped, the tragic Getty, the heir who was left behind. He was viewed through the lens of what had happened to him, not who he was. Even his attempts at building a creative life, his involvement in art, film, or underground culture were overshadowed by the shadow of his family name. No matter where he went, the weight followed, and eventually, that weight crushed him. We often talk about the burden of legacy, but we rarely unpack what that really means. For some, legacy is a privilege, a launchpad. For others, like Paul, it's a cage with velvet bars. The world gave him no space to be ordinary, no room to fail without cameras, no way to outgrow the pain he didn't choose. And so we arrive at the question that lingers long after the story ends. What does this tell us about ourselves? What does it say that a boy mutilated in captivity had to wait for the ransom to be tax-deductible before help arrived? What does it reveal when the story becomes entertainment? When the suffering becomes content? Are we, as a society, comfortable with watching tragedy unfold so long as it's framed in wealth? Do we excuse cruelty when it wears a tailored suit? These questions don't come with clean answers, but they're the ones this story demands we sit with. Because the truth is, this wasn't just a failure of one family. It was a reflection of a culture that often confuses financial worth with human value, that mistakes inheritance for intimacy, that forgets, especially in the gilded rooms of power, that empathy cannot be outsourced. John Paul Getty III didn't die the day he was kidnapped. He didn't die the day he overdosed, or the day he lost his speech. He died, piece by piece, every time his pain was ignored, every time his voice was dismissed, every time the world looked away because his last name was too expensive to pity. And in that way, his life remains a question we haven't yet answered. So maybe the question was never about why Paul Getty was kidnapped. Maybe it was always about what happened after. What choices were made, what silences were kept, and what kind of world allows a boy to suffer not because no one could help, but because they chose not to. We often talk about legacy in terms of empires, fortunes, names carved in stone. But perhaps legacy is also found in the quiet moments, the phone call you answer, or the one you ignore, the life you save, or the one you let wither behind glass walls and family myths. Not every tragedy ends in fire. Some simply fade, year by year, behind polite wealth and tightly drawn curtains. And so we're left to ask not just about the Getty's but about ourselves. What would we have done if it were our name on the envelope, our ear on the front page, our silence on record? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about the power behind the curtains, then look away. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss the truths that were never meant to be seen. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning. Goodbye, and see you soon.